Okay, so we discussed some correlational study design. Obviously, there are many more different studies that are possible where you can um, use a bunch of measurements and model the associations between them. And there are some specific types of studies that can also fall into the correlational design group. Some people like Goodwin classify them as quasi-experiments, but as we discussed, because there is no intervention, it's better to classify them as correlational studies or non-experimental empirical studies. And these are two types of studies, psychogenetic studies and cross-cultural studies, that I would like to spend a little bit of time on because they might be interesting and they might be useful for you at some point. What are psychogenetic studies? It's a situation when you measure a bunch of variables in different individuals and you're interested in whether belonging to different groups explains the differences in the strength of associations. So basically, is a trait heritable or is a trait acquired because of environment? This is the main question of psychogenetic studies. Whether the variance in individual differences on a certain trait, for example, intelligence or math ability or music ability, etc., is it associated with genes or is it associated with environment? And in order to test this hypothesis, in order to explore this question, these studies normally use samples of different types of twins, monozygotic twins who share 100% of their genes, and dizygotic twins who share an unknown percentage of their genes, but on average it's supposed to be 50%. And some studies also use non-blood related siblings, children who grew up in the same family but who don't have any relationship in terms of their genetic background. For example, one of them was adopted. And then you compare the correlation in monozygotic and dizygotic twins, and if this correlation is vastly different, it means that the contribution of genes is very important. And in ancient times, when people just had the correlations to analyze this data, they would calculate this heritability coefficient, basically the difference between the correlation coefficient for intelligence of monozygotic twins within each pair and the correlation coefficient for the same variable for dizygotic twins. So this difference between correlation coefficients multiplied by 2 was interpreted approximately as percentage of variance of trait that is attributable to genetics rather than environment. Of course, nowadays, people don't use such simple formulae anymore, and there are much more complicated models, like the ACE model for genetic differences. But this type of data is very interesting because this is the type of data that we encounter fairly often. And it can also be called dyadic data because twins, they form a homogeneous group. So it's a little bit like hierarchically structured data. So if you have data from two people within each family, like twins or husband and wife or partners, etc., this is a dyad. And you might be interested in modeling separately the variance within dyads and between dyads. And there are special models to treat this type of data whatsoever. But altogether, this is also correlational data because there is no intervention. Another type of correlational study, which is a bit special, is called cross-cultural study. In a cross-cultural study, we have several cultural groups in our sample. For example, people from different countries like Russia, China, or the US. And we are interested whether their scores on some psychological variables differ, or whether some kind of variables at the level of culture are related to one another. Or maybe whether these cultural level variables, such as individualism of culture or GDP in the country, explain the associations between individual variables. And this is already a multi-level kind of hypothesis. And in principle, when you conduct a cross-cultural study, you can use two different approaches. One approach that was used traditionally by ethnographers is called IMIC approach, when they try to explore and explain and describe the specific features of each country. And this, in terms of psychometrics, it means that for each culture you need to develop a special questionnaire, because you need to tailor the questions to the specific characteristics of this culture. But the problem is that if you have different questions for different cultures, you cannot really make any quantitative comparison between those countries or cultures. The only comparison you can make is qualitative. That's why this kind of approach, even though in some cases theoretically it may be strongly justified, it is rarely used because people want to perform quantitative comparisons. That's why we use another approach, which is called ETIC approach, when we use the same questionnaire in different countries and we try to compare those countries. But the main challenge in this situation is that we need to ensure that this questionnaire works in the same way in different languages, and that there is no bias due to differences in the samples between those countries or in the type of administration, etc. And we use some complex procedures, some organizational and statistical measures in order to make sure that this bias does not affect our conclusion. Why does this bias even arise? Because there is cultural relativity in the perception of different images or different words. The same word which is translated into different languages based on dictionary might have slightly different meanings, and even geometric figures may have some associations, for example, with letters, as in this example. That's why when you transplant your stimulus material from one culture to another, you might see some unexpected effects. That's why, first of all, when we use a test or a questionnaire in two different languages, we need to make sure that there is a good translation. And people say, okay, I will make a translation and back translation. So I will use a translator who will translate from one language to another, and then another independent translator will make a back translation. And if the back translation is the same as the original text, then I will say, okay, maybe it's the same thing. The problem is that this procedure only guarantees you linguistic equivalence. The words in one language will be translated, substituted with the words in another language. But it does not mean that there is psychological equivalence, because the same verbal formulations may have different meaning in different cultures. For example, in one study we translated the word discouraged by обескураживать, and in the back translation this was an exact back translation, but in Russian this word обескураживать was a completely strange word. It's very rare and many people don't really understand it. That's why this item did not work in the same way, and we should have really changed this item with another one. Sometimes you need to completely change an item. For example, in one questionnaire which is called Zimbardo Time Perspective Inventory, there is a final item which is notoriously difficult to translate. It measures future time perspective. It's a reverse scored item, and it goes, there will always be time to catch up on my work. And this item is very difficult to translate. In Russian it was translated as Я согласен с поговоркой «Работа не волк, в лес не убежит». I agree with the statement «My work is not a wolf, it will not run from me to the forest». And it's a well-known Russian saying which is familiar to everyone from childhood, and the meaning is very straightforward, which is there will always be time to catch up on my work. But this formulation has nothing in common with the original English language formulation. So linguistically it's completely different, but psychologically it's equivalent. Psychometrically it has the same properties, so it's a really good translation. And in order to arrive at such a good translation, you need to use not just translation back translation, but also some expert procedure. You need to sit down with maybe those translators and look together at your stimulus material, and maybe together with the author of the original questionnaire, in order to make the best choice. Which translation would be optimal? Which translation would convey the meaning rather than the verbal form of the expression? And after you have done a good translation, if you are conducting a cross-cultural study, you need to think about the three possible sources of bias. First of all, the construct needs to exist in all cultures, and it needs to be expressed in pretty much the same way. And there are well-known cultural differences. There are culturally specific constructs. For example, the Russian concept of avos. The word avos can be translated into English as perhaps, but this perhaps does not really convey the meaning. So this construct is some kind of hope that things will turn out in a good way, but without any effort on my side. And this is not fatalism, because it has a kind of negative positive connotation. So if you want to measure such a construct, you may be encountering the fact that it does not exist in some countries. Another potential source of bias is method bias. If you use different samples in different countries, in one country you use a group of students, in another country you use a group of employees, the differences between those groups might be due to demographic differences or might be due to cultural differences. So it's best to use comparable samples in different countries with the same administration procedures, the same settings, etc. And finally, the third source of bias comes from items. Some items may be poorly translated, and they may function in different ways in different countries. That's why, after we have made sure that constructs exist in different cultures, after we have made sure that the study was organized in the same way and the sample is comparable, the third thing is we need to cope with item bias. We need psychometrically to test whether this questionnaire is equivalent. And the rule number one is that the same questionnaire in two different languages, these are two different psychometric instruments with two different sets of psychometric properties. They have different structure, might have different structure, they might have different reliability, they might have different mean scores. But these mean differences might not be due to substantive differences on the construct. They might be due to item translations. That's why, in order to rule out those differences in item functioning, we perform some special analysis. And in applied social psychology program, you will have a separate course on confirmatory factor analysis where colleagues will explain to you all those different levels of invariance and assumptions that we make when we test for those levels of invariance. The only important idea that I would like to mention right now is that you should not compare raw scores across cultures without having tested for measurement invariance, without having shown that these scores are actually comparable. And as an illustration, I can show you this item from the same questionnaire, Zimbardo Time Perspective Inventory. These data come from a study that we conducted with my colleague Anna Sirtsova in 2014, and we tested the cross-cultural invariance of this questionnaire, which has 5 different scales measuring different time perspectives. One of them is called present hedonistic time perspective, which is a positive attitude towards the present, a tendency to enjoy the present, to live on the spur of a moment, to take risks, to be a little bit reckless, but to be open to the here and now, basically. And there are something like 11 items altogether in this scale, but some of them show really strong cultural differences. For example, this item 48, which in English goes like, I prefer friends who are spontaneous rather than predictable. And on this graph, you can see 3 groups of individuals with low level of hedonism, medium level, and high level of hedonism based on all the items of this scale. And on the vertical axis, you will see the average answer to this item 48. I prefer friends who are spontaneous rather than predictable. And this is split into 4 different countries. And you can see that, for example, if you compare the US and China, in China, people tend to agree with this item. Everyone in China seems to prefer spontaneous friends. In the US, much less so, but still much less so in Japan. And in Japan, as you can see, the slope of this association is also weaker. It appears that spontaneity for Japanese people, maybe it's not a very desirable characteristic of a person, but also probably it's not so much related to hedonism. So when people in Japan are hedonistic, it is not expressed in the choice of more spontaneous people as friends. Maybe everyone in Japan tries to avoid such people altogether, or I don't know. We need to conduct some interviews to understand what's going on there. And in Russia also, interestingly enough, this association is stronger. For people who are not hedonistic at all, Russians score very low. But if Russians are hedonistic, they have fairly high. They tend to agree with this item. And the slope of this association seems to be more steep in Russia than in Japan, the US, or China. And this can be explained by translation, because in Russian, when colleagues translated this item, they made it a little bit stronger. I prefer friends who are spontaneous and uninhibited rather than predictable. I can't remember what exactly the Russian formulation was, but they added a little bit of component. And as a result, we can see that this item works in a different way. And what does it mean in practice? If we compare people from China and from Japan, people from China will have a slightly higher average score on hedonism. But it does not mean that this is due to hedonism. It may be just due to this particular item, which was either mistranslated or to this particular expression of this construct. So if we want to compare people in China and in Japan in terms of how hedonistic they are, we need first to get rid of bias introduced by this particular item. And getting rid of this bias might be a tricky issue, which might require some confirmatory factor analysis. But the only conclusion that we can make is that we cannot really compare Chinese and Japanese, and probably Russians and Americans also on this measure, unless we cope with this bias, because this bias is fairly pronounced. And if you have never investigated this bias and you just have 2 questionnaires in 2 different languages, you should not assume that they are comparable, because in most cases there will not be. It's very hard to actually achieve this level of equivalence which allows you to compare raw scores. Most often, most questionnaires don't really allow us to do it. So we have taken a look at some research designs. We discussed quasi-experimental designs, and we discussed correlational designs, and we also discussed some tricky problems, some potential pitfalls associated with correlational analysis and correlational data all together. Of course, in some cases, we have a choice of a study design. We can conduct an experiment or a quasi-experiment or just a correlational study. How do we choose between those designs? First of all, it depends on do you really want to make a causal argument? If you want to make a strong causal argument, probably you need to conduct an experimental study, or at least a quasi-experiment. But of course, if it's not possible to manipulate your independent variable, then you have no other choice but conducting some kind of correlational or longitudinal study. Longitudinal design will be slightly better as evidence compared to just cross-sectional data. But of course, your time limitations might not allow you to test this longitudinal design. And also you need to know how much time it takes for your potential predictor to have an effect on your outcome. And this amount of time might be very large or it might be very small. So you need to time your measurements appropriately. And usually when you conduct some kind of study, it is a good practice to have a replication. So you can think about a series of studies where you will replicate your findings or achieve substantially similar findings using different designs. And if you have such a series of studies, this might be very publishable. This might be pretty good. So for example, you conduct a correlational study where you show an association, and then you conduct an experimental study where you show that manipulating a variable that has to do with one of those has an effect on the other one, but for example, not vice versa, etc. So there are many different ways you can combine studies with different designs within one research program. And this way, your research program becomes more diverse and more substantive as evidence of the effect that you would like to claim. And of course, whenever you decide in favor of a certain design, you always need to think about possible alternative explanations, possible threats to validity that might undermine your findings. Okay, so if you would like to explore some literature, there is the classical work of Campbell and Stanley for those who would like to be a bit more challenged, or you can choose Shadish, Cook, and Campbell, also a very good source. If you would like something simpler, something more accessible, Goodwin's textbook is also pretty good, but just don't be afraid when he uses the term quasi-experiment in a slightly more general sense. And there are, as always, some chapters for those who are specifically more interested in quasi-experiments or in statistical aspects of correlation or in twin studies or in cross-cultural studies. So there is a lot to choose from. As always, choose something that is interesting to you. And next time we will discuss, finally, the issue of statistical hypothesis testing, and we will see how the whole statistical paradigm has evolved throughout the 20th century. So see you quite soon. Bye-bye.